Chapter 23. Voted along party lines. On March 2, the House of Representatives meets before the Special Commission to finalize their decision, which is expected to be announced on the following day, March 3. By a vote of 137 to 88, the House of Representatives adopt a series of preambles introductory to the following resolution. Resolved by the House of Representatives of the United States, that it is the duty of the House to declare, and this House does solemnly declare that Samuel J. Tilden, of the State of New York, received 196 electoral votes for the office of the President of the United States, all of which votes were cast and lists thereof signed, certified, and transmitted to the seat of the government, directed to the President of the Senate, in conformity with the Constitution and laws of the United States, by electors legally eligible and qualified as such electors, each of whom has been duly appointed and elected in the manner directed by the legislature of the state in and for which he cast his vote aforesaid. And that said Samuel J. Tilden having thus received the votes of the majority of the electors appointed aforesaid, he is thereby duly elected President of the United States of America for the term of 4 years commencing on the 4th day of March, 1877. And this House further declares that Thomas A. Hendricks, having received the same number of electoral votes for the office of Vice President of the United States that were cast for Samuel J. Tilden for President as aforesaid, and at the same time and in the same manner, it is the opinion of this House that the said Thomas A. Hendricks, of the State of Indiana, is duly elected Vice President of the United States for the term of 4 years commencing on the 4th day of March 1877. At the Tilden estate in New York, Mary, Samuel and John Bigelow wait to hear the outcome of the voting. Samuel knows of the resolution being presented by the House of Representatives to elect him. He refuses to accept anything but the decision by the Special Commission, because it is now the rightful law to decide the election. He never agreed to its creation because he believed there never should have been any secrecy involved, and that the House should have debated it publicly. But since it was signed into law by President Grant, he feels bound by his ethics to abide by it. Breaking his train of thought, he turns as Bigelow's booming voice snipes, "There are 4 disputed states, Samuel, and you only need 1 electoral vote to end this charade." Samuel smirks and replies with sarcasm, "With 1 honest judge? The cards are stacked against me with Bradley. He's a Republican and I have a strong sense he will vote strictly along party lines." The 3 continue to discuss the ramifications of the deciding vote by Bradley. But then all grow quiet when Mr. Smith walks into the room and places a telegram into Samuel's hands. Samuel reads it and places it on a nearby table without saying a word. He watches in silence as Mary leans over and picks up the telegram, reading it silently at first. She then clears her throat and reads out loud, "By a party line vote they have decided 8-7. She looks up from the paper and into her brother's eyes. In a deadpan voice, she continues, "Hayes is elected." John Bigelow is rattled by the news but stays quiet waiting for Samuel to say more. Slowly returning her gaze back to the paper in her hand, she takes the telegram and crumples it in her hand. Angry, because she believes her brother did not put up enough of a fight, she snipes, "They know you were elected and just stole your presidency. Your supporters will be outraged, rightfully so." Trying to keep his own anger in check, Samuel fires back at her, "They handled this all wrong, I advised, and they ignored my warnings." Samuel stands, and calls out Mr. Smith's name as he walks out of the room. "Mr. Smith, I need to send a wire." Back at the House of Representatives, Hewitt and Randall argue in the House that the Commission is unconstitutional. It is March 3, 1877, 1 a.m. The congressmen and senators are arguing fiercely with each other, with accusations flying back and from across the room. In the spectators' area, John Reed and Zach Chandler listen to their boisterous exchanges. Then Chandler smiles and puts his arm around Reed's shoulder and grips him tightly. "I think this is it, my friend. Well done. Reed smiles back. At the front of the room, Speaker Randall stands with Senator Ferry at his side. Ferry bangs the gavel to stop the men from fighting. Hewitt and the others ignore them and continue arguing with each other. Ferry continues to bang his gavel. Gentlemen, we must have order, we must have order. As the men continue to bicker, a messenger enters the chamber and walks directly to Randall. Without a word, in the midst of the chaos, he hands Randall a telegram and walks away. Randall reads the telegram, and then hands it to Senator Ferry. After reading the telegram, Ferry steps down off the center podium and Randall steps up. He takes the gavel and bangs it. He shouts out loud, waving the telegram, "Gentlemen, I have just received a wire from Mr. Tilden." This gets everyone's attention and the men stop arguing and turn to listen. Randall shouts out, "Mr. Tilden is willing to let the count be concluded." There is a pause of brief silence, and the men begin to fight again. Senator Ferry steps back up to the podium and shouts, "Hayes and Wheeler are hereby duly elected." Hewitt, after hearing the announcement, collapses to the floor. Several men run over to help him up and walk him out of the House chambers. Back in the spectators area, John Reed, managing editor of the New York Times, and Zach Chandler, as chairman of the Republican National Committee, manager of Rutherford B. Hayes' 1876 campaign for the presidency, just pulled off the biggest scam ever in America's history to steal a presidency. He and Reed have huge smiles and quietly pat each other on the back. Zach Chandler says to Reed, "If it wasn't for you and the New York Times editorial staff, this would have never happened." Reed replies sarcastically, "As you and others now realize, the Democrats are not fit to run this country." Just a few days before Hayes is sworn in, the World newspaper reports that Mr. Tilden, under the alleged authority of General Woodford, the United States District Attorney for the Southern District of New York, is about to take the oath of office as president in New York and proclaim himself President of the United States. When asked by other reporters if this is true, John Bigelow responds, with Tilden's approval, by a written letter to the media. After finishing his written response, Bigelow asks Mary to read it aloud for him and Samuel. Mary, standing a few feet away from them, takes the letter from Bigelow and proceeds to read out loud. There were two contingencies in which it would have been lawful and obligatory for Mr. Tilden to have taken the official oath as president. First, if Congress had performed its constitutional duty of counting the electoral votes and had declared that Mr. Tilden was chosen by the electoral colleges. The two houses of Congress have all the powers for verifying the electoral votes which by the Constitution or the laws confer or allow. Nobody else in the federal government has any such powers. This exclusive jurisdiction of the two houses has been exercised without interruption from the beginning of the government. It is known to all those who came in contact with Mr. Tilden at this period that he concurred in this view of the powers and duties of the two houses of Congress exclusively to count the electoral vote. He was perfectly free and unreserved in the expression of his opinions on this subject. This contingency, however, never presented itself. Congress, before time fixed by law for counting the electoral votes, passed the Electoral Bill, wherein it substantially abdicated its powers and enacted that the Electoral Commission should, in the first instance, make a count and that its count should stand unless overruled by the concurrent action of the two houses. The Electoral Tribunal counted Mr. Tilden out, and counted in a man who was not elected. Congress did not overrule their count. Consequently, the false count stood as law under the Act of Congress. Secondly, the other contingency, in which it would have been lawful and obligatory on Mr. Tilden to have taken the oath of office, was that the House of Representatives, on the failure of a choice of president by the electoral colleges, had itself proceeded to make the election, voting by states in the manner prescribed by the Constitution. This contingency, like the first one, never occurred. The House of Representatives is required, by the express language of the Constitution, to elect the president when neither of the candidates can command a majority of the electoral votes. The right of the two houses to count the electoral votes and to declare that any person has a majority is a matter of implication, precedent, and practice. But the right of the House of Representatives to supply the failure of a choice is a positive constitutional command. It is not only a right, but a duty. The provision is mandatory. The House is a witness at the opening of the certificates. It is an actor in counting the votes by its own tellers and in its presence. Having such and the best means of knowing whether a choice has been made by the electoral colleges, it is also expressly vested with a power and duty to act exclusively and conclusively in the event that no person proves to have been chosen by a majority of the votes of those colleges. The House acquires jurisdiction by that fact. The assent of the Senate to the existence of that fact is nowhere prescribed or required. No judgment, certification, or act of any official body is interposed as a condition to the assuming of jurisdiction by the House. When the House has once acted in such a case, no review of its actions nor any appeal from its decision is provided for in the Constitution. It is difficult to see why the House in such a case, like all tribunals of original jurisdiction and subject to no appeal, did not insist upon its rights as the exclusive judge of the fact and the law from which it acquired jurisdiction. It was, I am told, a fear that the Senate might lead a resistance to the rightful judgment of the House, and that General Grant would sustain a revolutionary policy with the Army and Navy and the militia of the great states in which the Republicans had possession of the governments, that deterred the House of Representatives from the assertion of its rights and induced it to abdicate in favor of the Electoral Commission. But without speculating upon causes or motives, one thing is certain: the House of Representatives did not elect Mr. Tilden in the manner prescribed by the Constitution. On the other hand, it did concur with the Senate in anticipating and preventing the contingency in which it might have been compelled to act, thus providing an expedient which disarmed it. It adopted the electoral law and went through all the forms required for the execution of the electoral scheme. True, it afterwards passed a declaratory resolution condemning the action of that tribunal and asserting that Mr. Tilden had been duly elected, but the Constitution had not provided that a man should or could take office as president on a declaratory resolution of the House of Representatives merely. If that resolution could have had full effect to abrogate the electoral law which the House had assisted to enact, it would have created no warrant of authority to Mr. Tilden to take the oath of office. A vote by states that he should be the next President of the United States was still necessary to give Mr. Tilden any more title to the succession than General Grant, and that vote the House of Representatives never gave him. I might have disposed of your question more briefly by simply saying that no contingency provided by the Constitution ever existed in which Mr. Tilden could lawfully or properly take the oath of office as President. I have dwelt upon the matter at some length because of its future as well as past importance. The idea that Mr. Tilden ever thought of taking the oath of office illegally is in my judgment quite as preposterous as is the other idea that would have omitted to take it if any contingency had arisen in which it was his right or duty to take it. Or that any menace would have had the slightest influence his performing his whole obligation to the people. I will venture to say that if it had been his right and duty to take the oath he would have done so at the City Hall in New York, surrounded by the forces which, according to Mr. Mines General Woodford pictured to his imagination, but at the federal capital, even though he had known he would be kidnapped or subjected to a drumhead court-martial 5 minutes afterwards. It is doubtless true that revolutionary ideas were entertained by the hierarchy of office holders in possession of the government. General Grant did utter menaces in published interviews and did make a display of military force in Washington to overawe Congress. I presume this was a part of the system of intimidation for which he allowed himself to be used by the office holders, and which was intended to act upon public opinion through fear of disturbance, as well as upon Congress. But it is safe to say that whatever the effects they produced, they did not prevent Mr. Tilden from taking the oath of office. The feat that he would do so, which induced the Republicans to swear their candidate into office privately on the Saturday previous to the commencement of his term of office, besides repeating the ceremony at the inauguration, was born of that consciousness which causes the wicked to fell when no man pursueth. I was aware that about that time Mr. Tilden's house was besieged by emissaries of the press and the telegraph to know if the rumors to that effect which prevailed in Washington were true. This was a species of curiosity which I believe Mr. Tilden did not consider it any part of his duty to relieve. To conclude, so the action of the Electoral Commission has conferred upon Mr. Tilden the unique distinction of being the first, let us hope the last, President-elect of the United States feloniously excluded from the chief magistracy, a distinction which, like the banishment of Aristides, the assassinations of Caesar, of Henry IV of France, of Lincoln, and of Carnot, makes it one of the conspicuous and indestructible landmarks of history. Mary pauses for a moment, reflecting upon what she had just read. She then looks up from the letter and says to Samuel, "It's very good." Samuel agrees and thanks John for writing it. Telegrams were still coming in from all over the country with thousands of his supporters pledging to take up arms for him. People were willing to do anything he asked of them, but Samuel, after all of violence, death and destruction endured by the country with the recent close of the Civil War, he was adamant about not wanting any bloodshed in his name.